Hey everybody, welcome back to SimpleTrader. Last time we set up our authentication service so that users can log in and register with SimpleTrader. And after doing that, we came into this startup method and we just created an authentication service and tried logging in and tested out to make sure that worked. Now in this episode, we're going to be taking this a step further and actually writing unit tests for our authentication service. So what we're going to do is get rid of this little test right here in our startup, and we're going to create a new project. So let's go to our solution, add a new project, and we're going to be doing an NUnit test project. So we're going to be using NUnit for our unit tests, and let's go ahead and select that, .NET Core, click Next. For the project name, we're going to be using SimpleTrader, because that's the name of our application. We're going to add .domain, because we're going to be testing our domain layer with this project. This test project is not going to be testing the NUnit framework, the WPF. It is only going to be testing the domain layer. And then finally, we will add .tests, because these are tests for our domain layer. So let's go ahead and create that project. And there we go. We have our unit testing project. Let's go ahead and get rid of this first unit test. And let's open up our domain project. So what I like to do is create a new folder, and I'm going to name this services. And what I'm trying to do is make my folder structure in my test project match the folder structure in my actual domain project. So we have services and services here. Let's open that up. And we have another folder for authentication services. So let's create a folder here in our test project. And now inside this folder, we have an authentication service. So down here, we're going to create our authentication service test. So as you see, our folder structure is parallel with the folder structure in our domain layer, so that it's easy to find the tests that correspond to the class that is being tested. So now we're in our test class right here. Let's go ahead and make this public. And the first thing we need to do is mark this class as a test fixture so that NUnit recognizes this class contains unit tests and actually runs the tests inside the class. Next thing we're going to do is actually create a test. So we're going to create a public void. So your test methods actually have to be void. They should not return anything. And let's go into our authentication service and let's figure out what we want to test. So what I want to do is I want to test this login method. So let's go back to our test, and we're going to start our function name with login. And now back in our authentication service, what scenario do I want to test? I want to test the user logging in with an account that actually exists with the correct password. So let's go into our test, and after this login, after we prefix this function with login, we're going to put an underscore and then describe the scenario. So we are logging in with the correct password for existing user, and now we'll put another underscore. And now let's go back to our authentication service. What do we want that scenario to return? Well, we want it to return an account with the correct username. So after that last underscore, we will end this method with returns account for correct username. And actually, back in this scenario, let's make this for existing username. And that is our naming convention here. So we have the method we're testing, the scenario, and what we expect to return. Of course, this is a really long method name, so maybe you could cut it down a little bit with correct password for existing username. I don't know. It's not a big deal because this is just a test project, so the names can get a little bit long. Now what we need to do is actually mark this method as a test so that NUnit will actually run this method when we go to test. And now let's actually implement this test. So as you all probably know, the 3 A's of unit testing, so we need to arrange, then we need to act, and then we need to assert and make sure that we get the correct result. So first thing we need to do is actually arrange, and inside here we are going to create everything that we need to run our test scenario. So obviously we're going to need our authentication service. So let's go ahead and actually add a reference to our domain project. We haven't done that yet. So we'll add that reference so that we can use our authentication service. And we'll just call this authentication service and just create one right here. Now as you see, our authentication service actually needs an iAccount service and an iPassword hasher. And we're not actually going to be passing in actual implementations of our account service or the iPassword hasher, because if we passed in, say, our Entity Framework account service right here, then if there was a bug in that Entity Framework account service, it would make it look like there was a bug in our authentication service. And another thing with that is we don't want to be testing against our database. That would be crazy. But what we're going to do instead is actually create mocks for these services for this password hasher. And then we're really only testing our authentication service, because that's what this is all about. This is our authentication service tests. So what we need to do is create mocks for these dependencies right here. And to do that, we're going to go to our unit test project, and we're going to manage our NuGet packages, and we are going to browse for mock and install that. And this package is going to let us mock those dependencies, as we will see in just a second. So back in our test project, what we're going to do is create a mock for our iAccount service. So this is like a generic class right here. This mock, you can take in whatever you want to mock. We'll call this the mock account service, and just create it right here. And let's import everything that we need. So we need our domain service for that iAccount service, and we need to import mock as well. And now we have this mock account service. Now in our authentication service, the first parameter here, we can specify that as our mock account service dot object, and dot object will give us the actual implementation of an iAccount service, or not really the actual implementation, but the actual mocked implementation, if that makes any sense. Now we're also going to be mocking a password hasher as well. So let's create that mock right here. Let's import password hasher. We'll call this mock password hasher. And there we go. Now we can take this mock password hasher and pass that through the constructor as well. Dot objects. So now we have our authentication service. Let's act on that service. So let's use the authentication service, and we're testing the login method here, and we're testing with a correct password for an existing username. So we don't actually have those, so let's add those in our arrange method, or in our arrange section up here. So we will create a string for the username, and we'll just call this test user. And then we'll have a string for our password as well, and we'll just call this test password. You can really just call it whatever you want. So now back in this login method, let's specify that username and the password. And as we see, this returns an account, so let's grab that so we can make sure we get the correct result. Have to import account as well. And as we see, we get a little bit of error here because this is an async method, so we need to await it. And if we want to await it, then this test needs to be an async task. So I did previously mention that your test shouldn't return anything, they should just be voids. But NUnit does support an async task because you're really just returning a task that gets awaited and then nothing really gets returned. So now we get our account back, and what we're trying to do is make sure the account that gets returned is for this user. So in this assert, we will assert .r equal, and in here we can pass in the expected and the actual. So our actual username, let's actually grab that right here. So actual username is equal to the account that we got back dot username, or dot account holder dot username. And up here, let's change this username to expected username. And now in this r=equal method, this assertion right here, we can pass in the expected username, and we will compare it to the actual username and make sure they are equal. And now let's actually run this test. So to run your test, let's go up to this test tab, and we're going to open the test explorer. And as you see down here, we have our test. So let's go ahead and run it and just see what happens. And obviously our test fails. Now actually, I want to debug this test. Let's go to our authentication service and put a breakpoint right here. And now what I'm going to do is right click this and click debug, so we can actually walk through the test. So now we hit this breakpoint, we have our account service. We're going to call get by username for our test user. So let's step over that, and we look at stored account, it returned null. And that is because we didn't set up our mock to return anything for get by username. So let's go back to our test right here, and we need to take our mock account service, and we need to set up the get by username method to actually return an account. So what we're going to do is set up, it's just a inline expression lambda right here. We're setting up get by username, and if the string passed in is the expected username, then it's going to return async, since this is an async method. And what it's going to return is a new account, and this account is going to have an account holder, which is a new user, and that user is going to have a username with our expected username. So now let's go back here and let's put a breakpoint again, and let's debug this test. So now we get by username for our test user, and now it returns that stored account. We look at the account holder, and they have a username of test user. So now let's step over this verify hashed password, and the password result is failed. And the reason it is failed is because we didn't set up our mock to return success. So we need to set up our password hasher to return success when the correct password is used. So let's go down here, and we're going to use our mock password hasher, set up again, and we're going to set up the verify hashed password. And this actually takes two arguments here, the hashed password and the provided password. Now in our case, all that we have is the provided password, so we're going to pass that in. And what we're going to do for this first argument is we're going to say it.isAny string. So basically, verify hashed password, for this hashed password part, it can take in any string. We don't care what the user's hashed password is. We are just going to return success if this password gets passed in, because we're assuming that for this scenario the user has the correct password. So this is going to return password, password verification result dot success. And there we go. So now let's actually run this test. And there we go, our test passes. So there's our first unit test. Let's write another one. And to do that, I'm actually going to copy all of this and paste it down here. And let's actually change this to be login with incorrect password. And what we're going to do for that is it's going to throw an invalid password exception. So throws invalid password exception for username. And obviously we need to refactor because we have a lot of duplication here. So what we can do with NUnit is we can create a method, and we'll mark it as a setup method, and it'll just be a public void setup. And what's going to happen is for every test, this method is going to run. So not just once per, like all of your tests, for each individual test, this setup method is going to run. So what we're going to do here is do a little bit of our arranging in this setup method. And what we can do is create our mocks and create our authentication service that we test against. So let's go ahead and grab this. So we create our authentication service, and then we create our mocks as well in this setup method. Let's grab those. And there we go. Now what we're going to do is actually put these mocks and this authentication service that we create into fields so that our tests can access them. So let's create a private field up here for a mock password hasher, and this will just be a mock password hasher, and then we'll set that field in this setup method, and we'll do that for all of our stuff. So let's create a mock for our account service, and we'll call this mock account service. And set that down here. And then last but not least, we'll do that for our authentication service as well. And now we need to update this to use the private field. And there we go. We've set up our mocks and our authentication service, and we can use that in our tests now. So now this is going to use that private field. And we do our setup right here. And we can get rid of that down here. So our mocks, we create them down here. Don't need to do that anymore. And now we still have some duplication, obviously, since we did copy and paste this. But this login with incorrect password, the mock setups are actually going to be different. So verify hash password is going to return failed now because the user has the incorrect password. And let's set these to the private fields real quick. And get by username in this case is still going to return the expected user. So now let's do some acting down here. So what we're going to do is we are going to make sure that this login method throws an invalid password exception. So our act and our assert here are kind of mixed together because what we need to do is call assert.throws async, since it's an async method. And now inside here we specify the method that is going to throw, and that's just going to be through a lambda. So our authentication service .login is going to throw, and what we wanted to throw we can specify in this generic throws async. We wanted to throw a invalid password exception. So let's paste that in there, import that. And now throws async returns that exception. So let's get that. It's an invalid password exception. And now, so we're going to make sure it throws. And now inside this assert, we need to make sure that the exception that it threw is for the expected username. So what we can do is say actual username equals exception dot username, and then we just run our assertion again for our equal. Now another thing to note is that since we do throws async right here, we don't actually specify any async await, so this can just be a regular void method. And now let's go ahead and run our tests again. And there we go, our test passed. It did throw the invalid password exception. Now if we look at our tests so far, we see that both of these scenarios are for an existing username, so the user does exist. Now let's write a test for if the user does not exist. Let's copy this test that we have so far, and let's change this to with non-existing username. So that means this get by username method is going to return, it's actually going to return null. But you can't set up a method to return null, so what you can do instead is just remove the setup completely, and since you didn't set up that method on the mock, it's just going to return null anyways. So now let's actually see what would happen if our get by username returns null. Well, we don't actually have to walk through this and do some debugging. We can see stored account would be null, and then we would try to get the password hash on the stored account, and we would get a null pointer. So what we need to do is, if stored account is null, we need to throw an exception, because that means the user doesn't even exist and you can't log in anyways. So we're going to do a little if statement right here. So if stored account equals null, we are going to throw a new exception. And let's actually create an exception up here. And we will call this user not found exception. And we'll make that public and inherit from exceptions so that we can throw it. And we'll generate all of these constructors. Get rid of the protected one because we don't need it in this case. And what we're actually going to do is put a property up here for the username that we could not find. And then let's select that. And let's add it to these constructors. Like that. And there we go. Okay. So now back in our login method down here, we are going to throw a new user not found exception, and it's going to take in the username. So now that we have this case defined, we need to run through the scenario in our test. So we already have this set up, and what we're going to do is when we run this method, we expect to get back a user not found exception. So let's grab that. And same thing as before, it has a username property on it, and we're just going to make sure that it throws the exception and that the username on the exception matches the username that we pass in. So let's go ahead and run this test. And there we go, our test passes. So we have fully tested this login method. We've gone down each code path, and I feel pretty confident about this login method. Next up, we're going to test our register method, and as you can see, we have a lot of scenarios to test for. So let's head back into our unit tests, and let's create a new test. So this is going to be a public async task, and this time we are testing register. And the first scenario that we are going to test is registering with passwords that do not match. So with passwords not matching, and that's going to return passwords do not match, which is the enum right here. So passwords do not match. So first thing we need to do is arrange. So what we are going to do here is specify what we expect to get back from our method. So it's going to be a registration result, and this is going to be the expected. And we expect to get back passwords do not match. Now we need to act, so we need to actually use our authentication service, and that's going to give us back a registration result, and this is going to be the actual result. And we're going to call our authentication service.register, and we need to pass in an email, a username, a password, and a confirm password. Now for this method, we don't really care about the username or the email. We only care about the password and the confirm password. So what we can do is specify an it.isAny here, because we simply do not care. It can be any string. And we can do that for the username as well. And then for the password, we should actually create variables for this, so we can specify a password up here like that. And then our confirm password obviously is going to not match this actual password right here. So we'll just call this confirm test password. And then we can pass those in here like that. And now we can do our assertion, and we need to make sure that the actual result was our expected passwords do not match. like that. So let's go ahead and run this test. And there we go, our test passes. So now, let's see what our next scenario is. So now we need to see if get by email returns, or if get by email does not return null, then the email already exists. So let's go ahead and copy this, just to set up a little bit. So with already existing email returns email already exists. So that's going to be our registration result that we expect email already exists. And let's get rid of this. And this time we need to make sure the passwords do match, so we can just say test and test. So our passwords will match, and we'll get past this block right here. And now we need email account to return a non-null value. So if email account is not null, then the email already exists. So we can set that up down here. So our mock account service, we're going to set up get by email. And let's actually create a variable up here for that email. So we'll just call this test@gmail.com. And we'll pass that into this. So if get by email receives this email, then we're going to return async a new account. So the account that comes back will not be null. So that means we're going to get email already exists. So now let's actually pass this email into our register method like this. And now we're ready to run this test. And there we go, our test passes. So now we need to pretty much do the same thing, but instead get by username is going to return a non-null value. So let's go ahead and grab this. We're just going to copy this method. And so this is going to be with already existing username is going to return username already exists. So now this time, get by email is actually going to return null. So that means we don't need to set it up, because we want it to return null so that we get past this block, and then we fail on this one and set the result to username already exists. So what we can do is just change this to get by username like that. Change this string to username, and we'll just make this test user. Move that down here. And get by username is going to return the non-null value, but since we didn't set up get by email, it's going to return null. So get by email returns null, we get past there. Get by username does not return null, username already exists. So now, for this register method, we can make this the it.isAnyString, because we don't care what the email is, and register, it does need to be the username that we expect, so that get by username returns the new account. And this time, the registration result is going to be username already exists. So now let's run this test. And there we go, that test passes. So what is next? So we've done all of our validation, and now the result is going to be success. So now we pretty much just need to do the mighty test where we get the success result. So let's copy this and register. So we're going to be registering with new user, or with non-existing user, and matching passwords, and it's going to return success. There we go. So now we can remove this setup right here for get by username, because we just want get by username to return null now, and we need our passwords to match. We have that down there. Our expected result is success. We can remove username, because we don't really care what the username is. Let's just set that as a string. And now we can run this test, and this is the simplest test ever. So we're just going to run through that method, register, and the test does pass. And one last thing I actually want to try is making these passwords and the confirm password. Let's actually try and make those it.isAnyString as well, and see if that is still considered matching. Because I just don't like having these hard-coded strings right there. I assume I could move them to variables, but let's just try and do this instead. So let's run that. And yeah, the passwords do match. So we can make all of these tests it.isAnyStrings. So we can get rid of those and get rid of those. I just don't like having those strings hard-coded there. I feel like it's a little bit distracting. Like someone might look at that string and be like, is that meaningful for the test? And I really just want it to be clear that for these methods, we're not really doing anything with those passwords and those confirmed passwords. So that pretty much sums up all of our unit tests. Let's get one big test run. Let's run all of our tests. Make sure they all pass. And there we go. Our authentication service is tested. So that's going to wrap up this episode. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys learned a little bit about unit testing. It's super powerful, helps you deploy with confidence, as they say, and I am feeling pretty confident about this authentication service. If you have any questions, criticisms, or comments, be sure to leave them below in the comment section. Just clean this up a little bit. But other than that, if you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like or subscribe for more.